Let me begin with the land acknowledgement, please. While participants of this meeting of the National Union of Public and General Employees are in different locations, I am currently on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We recognize and acknowledge the harms and the crimes that have been committed in the past, and we dedicate ourselves as a union to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous peoples in a spirit of reconciliation and striving for justice. And it hasn't been that long since September the 30th, the first National Day of Reconciliation. And I assume, like most of you, I spent some of the day reading the reports from people who had been through that terrible experience of the residential schools. And it just, it made me personally feel so recommitted to the fact that my culture did wrong, my ancestors did wrong, and it's up to us to remedy that to the best of our ability. So there's also an anti-harassment statement that we refer to at the beginning of every meeting, and that I believe will be posted in the chat. And if anybody on this call needs any reminder, the simple fact is we don't expect to be able to harass each other, and we won't tolerate it in a National Union event. So with that, welcome. This is interesting times, as they say. At the end of October, there's going to be a new COP in town, that town being Glasgow. And that sort of begs the question, I guess, what is a COP? Well, the short answer, it's the United Nations Conference of the Parties, which means governments from around the world get together and have a conference. This is not the first one, it's COP26, a conference on how they're going to mutually respond to the environmental crisis. We'll get a further explanation from our guests, Eddy, Pérez, and Tara Peel. I'm going to introduce them more fully in a few minutes. But it was an earlier COP that brought us the Paris Agreement. And that was a real milestone agreement. That was the first time that almost every government in the world came to a legally binding commitment to each other to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It was a huge milestone, but it wasn't perfect, because not long after Donald Trump got elected, for example, he was able to pull out of the Paris Agreement without repercussions. And obviously that meant that the agreement was not as strong as it needed to be. And Canada is not alone in this, but Canada has not met its Paris targets yet. So it was good, but not perfect. And the context as we meet, we are in, of course, a climate emergency. And we have to understand, I think, as we think about COP and the other work that we're doing, that we are no longer fighting to prevent climate change. We're not fighting anymore to prevent global warming. We're fighting to keep it from developing even further than it has into being catastrophic for the world. But otherwise, it's already here, isn't it? The heat last summer in BC, unheard of. The drought in the Midwest, throughout Canada and the US. Australia was on fire a couple of years ago. Parts of Europe were flooded. There's more hurricanes and they're stronger. We could spend most of our hour talking about the evidence that climate change is here already. And we are already in a state of crisis. And I think we have to respond that way. And certainly we've been warned, virtually unanimous views of science. This is real. We caused it. And if we don't react strongly, humanity will suffer terrible damage. Those are all facts. And in the face of that, in the face of the incontrovertible evidence now that climate change is real and it is caused by human activity, we've got an energy treaty called the Energy Charter Treaty, which is where the fossil fuel companies got together and protected themselves with an international treaty. And the firms under that treaty are threatening multi-billion-dollar lawsuits against countries that interfere with the right to make a profit under the Paris Agreement. So capitalism is part of the problem. The right of people to make money off things that they have no business doing is part of the problem. There's even a term for it. There's a paradox of the commons. And what that means is that there's a paradoxical element to anything that is of common interest, because sometimes the common interest does not affect everybody individually the same way. So the commons is where they used to have grass growing in the middle of a village, and everybody could share in that grass. They could let their cows graze as long as it was kept under control, and everybody could share in it. And it was to mutual advantage. But an individual farmer overusing that right and coming in and having a whole herd of cows graze the commons to the ground may have made sense for that farmer, but it didn't make sense for the collective. So what we have to understand, I think, is that the collective of the world and the people in it are running contrary to the interests of some people who want to make their quick buck and, basically keep on causing harm. We need strong public sector intervention. We need laws and rules and public investment. And we've got to look to organizations like the COP, where they're bringing governments together to get them to understand that we need them to act strongly, and we can't just let it sort of develop organically within the investment community. A few years ago, the minority of voices were raising the alarm. And now during the election campaign, the National Union did a poll, and 80% plus of Canadians want climate action to be a priority for their new government. So it's well on the radar screen, and we need to force governments to listen to the people in a way that to respond adequately to the demands that are coming forward from the population. So is this a union issue? Is it our issue? Is our union in particular? Well, yeah. I mean, every member that we represent lives in Canada. A few, I guess, live elsewhere, but everybody lives on this world, on this planet. And they're all going to be affected. They all are being affected as we speak. And their rights as citizens, as people who live in this country, people who live on this planet, are directly affected. And increasingly, our members are going to be affected by the climate and the weather crises that are being caused by the change in the climate, the floods and the tornadoes and the fires. And we got a whole bunch of people in our union that are on the front lines. We have EMS folks. When there's a tornado, they have to be the ones that go to the disaster and try and help out and rescue people. We've got wildland firefighters who increasingly are being just put to the test right across this country, and in some cases right around the world. And unfortunately, our wildland firefighters, it is rare that a year goes by that we don't lose one of them, that we don't have one of them die in the service of trying to keep the wildfires under control. Our road maintenance people are affected every time there's a flood. They have to go out and work through really awful conditions to try and get the roads back in place. We've got healthcare workers who are having to face new healthcare threats and basically help to repair the damage that's done by a climate disaster. So we need to make sure that we work on the best occupational health rights that we can for all of our members on the front lines. And then we've got people who work for governments on climate issues. But right across the country, we will have people who work on policies, on mitigation, and so on. And their expertise probably is not being well enough used by their governments, because the governments are more cautious than the circumstances warrant. And I imagine our members are frustrated by that. So we want to find a way to bring our members together that know about climate change, know how to mitigate it, and give their expertise a chance to flourish where they don't have to be reporting just to the government on it. And finally, we're not all in the same boat, are we? We may be in the same ocean, but the size of our boats is real different. And inequality is a real problem for the world in general. It's a problem in Canada. And those people that are on the lower end of the income scale pay a higher price for climate change than the rest of us do. And so our social services people, for example, they have to pick up some of the pieces that are caused by climate change disasters. So we've got a whole number of reasons to be totally invested in the issue of climate change. It is our issue. And Secretary Treasurer Bert Blunden will be representing us at COP26. He's going to be there working with the official delegation, and we're going to have one person at least on the side events and civil society side events. So we're going to be there in person. We've got an advisory committee on the environment that works with us on these issues. They advise us on how to be more effective in dealing with this, quite frankly, really huge issue, and how to bring our weight to bear most effectively. And we've got a staff person, Nadia Ibrahim, who was the one who organized this session for us. And she is our staff person on environmental issues. And so we are moving on the question, and we want to do more. We believe we need to do more, and we're always looking for ways to be more effective. And let me make one last comment. We're in the fourth wave of COVID, and one of the things, so I wouldn't dare to call it a silver lining because this was a horrible experience to go through, but we did learn that we can react as a society through our governments. When there is a crisis, when there's an emergency, we can react, we can pull together, and we can face the crisis as a nation, as we did, as nations all across the world did. And when our governments react well and represent society well, they can lessen the damage done by those crises. So it's an important lesson for us to learn. So we're going to have, in a couple of minutes, we're going to have two speakers. We're going to have Eddy Pérez, who is with the International Climate Diplomacy Manager at the Climate Action Network. That's quite an impressive title. I like that, International Climate Diplomacy Manager. Formerly worked at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in Geneva. He's a lecturer at the University of Montreal, teaches climate justice and international cooperation. He chairs the G7 Climate and Energy Working Group, and he sits on the Canadian Domestic Advisory Group for the Canada-EU Trade Agreement, CETA, on climate issues, and has a Master of Science degree. So Eddy's going to talk to us about what COP really is, what it means, and what should we expect from it, and what should we try to achieve there through our governments. And then we're going to have Tara Peel speak to us. Tara is the National Coordinator of Health, Safety and Environment at the Canadian Labour Congress. She's responsible for developing national campaigns, providing analysis on a number of workplace health, safety, and sustainability issues. She was a member of that important task force on just transition for Canadian coal workers and coal power workers and communities, and is a member of the board of directors of the Climate Action Network of Canada and the National Steering Committee for the Green Economy Network. She's on the Council of Governors for the Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety, a member of the Occupational Health and Safety Advisory Committee to the Labour Program at Employment and Social Development Canada. And previously, Tara worked for health and safety and environmental issues at the Manitoba Federation of Labour. So as you can tell from those introductions, we have two wonderfully qualified people to speak to us. And Tara is going to speak to us after Eddy, and Tara's going to talk about the worker and union perspective on COP26, and what it means for workers and what we should expect and want. And then after those two speakers, we're going to open the floor to questions from you. If you have questions, please enter them in chat. And Nadia is going to be keeping track of the questions as they come in, and she will direct them to the speakers as appropriate after they've done with their presentation. So with all of that, Eddy, are you ready to take it away?
I am ready. I just need to maybe start my video. Okay, so that is happening right now. Thank you so much, Larry. Thank you to the National Union of Public and General Employees. I have a puppy, a 3-month-old puppy, so he might make some noise. Sometimes when I speak about climate, he makes much more noise than the usual. So don't be surprised if you hear someone running around behind me. I also want to thank you, Larry, for the introduction, and Nadia for organizing this event. And I am speaking currently in the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation in Tiohtià:ke, which is commonly known as Montreal, Quebec. And it's really always a pleasure to share this time with Tara, whom we work together on so many files. I'm going to start maybe sharing my slides, and I maybe want to make sure that you see them. So for me, COP26 in itself is an unusual COP. It is a COP that is happening in a world in crisis. And it is actually a COP that reflects on the power of resistance. It is an unusual COP because it's happening at such a difficult time in the history of this world, in the century. We're coming out of a pandemic that has exacerbated and amplified so much inequality. And it's actually showing the ability of rich countries to tackle this global crisis. For many around the world, the way in which we've handled the COVID-19 pandemic reflects a bit how we will handle the climate crisis, or how we've handled the climate crisis so far. And, you know, I think it's important to reflect on the context of the COP to understand why this COP is important. COP in itself, sorry, I did this 12 days ago, so I didn't change the day, but it happens in 27 days. And it is framed as the most important climate summit since Pérez, for the reasons that Larry mentioned: the climate crisis coming together, governments advancing the work that they have agreed to in Pérez. But I am actually wondering if it is. You know, you're going to hear a lot about this as we get closer to COP26. Many journalists will speak about it and frame it as this important moment. But let me tell you, COP26 success remains fragile because of the political context that is surrounding it. We're actually on our way towards one of the most unequal, unsafe, and exclusive summits, partly because one of the reasons why COP26 matters is because it offers power balance around the globe. COP is this moment where we could hold accountable governments for their climate commitments. But there is a case, a scenario, where not all governments could actually attend COP26. And the reason for that is global health and vaccine inequality. Even if this is a heads of government summit, at this moment, because of the rate of vaccination is so disparate between the North and the South, between developed and developing countries, because we have a rate of more than 80% of vaccinated people, and Africa only has a rate of, below 10 and even 5% in some countries, that is actually impacting the ability for these countries to be represented well at a summit. So that is the context of this COP. And that kind of inequality that is happening at the moment in our eyes will impact not only the participation of these countries, but also the decisions that we'll take. COP happens every year. It is an annual moment. It has been happening for the past 30 years. This is a photo, what you see in your left, of all the COPs that have happened and all the COPs that should happen before we get to 2050, when we're supposed to meet net zero goals, carbon neutrality goals. So we're kind of in the middle between the first COP and that COP in 2050. So it is an important COP in that sense. We're at a moment of history where this COP is the one that might set what we call the activation of the decade of action on climate change to reduce emissions to a level that can help us limit global warming to safe levels during this decade. COP has bodies. It is the conference of the parties. So every country that has agreed to be a member of the UNFCCC participates in these summits. But there are other bodies. The Paris Agreement has a body. And for that reason, it is an annual meeting. They meet every year to come together and agree on the things that need to happen in the future, hold each other accountable, and use the different bodies to identify progress on different issues. For example, there are spaces in the convention where governments talk about just transition and jobs. And if I show you the next slide, you have different constituted bodies that actually allow for governments to talk about just transition, about adaptation. Just transition, for example, it is the Katowice Committee of Experts, where there are 14 members, 14 government representatives. We're also part of it as civil society, but they meet 3 times a year, and then at COP to assess progress, give themselves opportunities to advance climate action in this context. So in itself, COP is an important moment because it has these meetings happening all along. And it's also a very complex decision-making process, with every country bringing their interests and they also want to get their share of this global summit happening every single year. Canada participates in many of these constitutive bodies. Canada is a very strong participant of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, wants to participate, for example, on other meetings related to the implementation of Article 6 and etc. But, and the third thing why this moment is important is because it's a moment for enhanced ambition. You know, in Paris 5 years ago, countries committed to bring forward climate pledges. Canada put forward theirs. You might remember the election, there was a debate about the conservative climate plan and the liberals climate plan. The conservative wanted to commit to their Paris pledges, which is the one that Canada made in 2015. That was the first pledge that Canada put forward in the context of the Paris Agreement. But in 2015, countries agreed to come back 5 years later with enhanced targets, with new plans to assess progress and to recommit to increasing action in the context of the climate crisis. So this year, countries will come back to talk about enhanced climate ambition. And they need to then assess if these plans are accurate in the context of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. So far, not all countries have submitted pledges. So the image that you see right here, in total, we have 120 countries that put forward climate pledges to the UNFCCC, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Canada is one of them. Canada actually put forward an enhanced pledge. And to say the least, they have increased their performance since 2015. That doesn't mean that they're good players. It only means that they have respected the obligations of the Paris Agreement. There are countries that have not. For example, so far, China has not put forward a new pledge, and that reflects on the outcome, and I'll show you why. And there are countries that have put forward inadequate pledges. Russia, for example, is one of them. Brazil is one of them. And there are countries who have said nothing on their NDC. One of them is India, who's a high emitting country. But I guess the question is, after everything that I've told you so far, okay, but is that really important? Like, ask yourself, why is it that COP matters? I mean, okay, these meetings are happening, diplomatic sessions are happening, countries are meeting, but why should we care? And for me, when I ask myself that question, it really comes back to, how can COP be successful when we are responding to multiple intertwined challenges? And I think that is what defines this year's momentum. And then the question that we need to ask is, what does COP26 need to deliver to signal that we're moving in the right direction? So we have identified a couple of gaps. The gaps that need to be addressed at this COP26, at this urgent COP. The first one is the emissions and ambition gap. That is, we're not going in the right direction. The other one is a finance gap. That means we're not investing as much money to put ourselves towards a pathway that limits global warming to 1.5. The other one is the Paris implementation gap. We gave ourselves a framework in 2015, and so far, there are so many things in the Paris Agreement that have not yet been agreed. We have a global solidarity and equality gap. I told you about the health crisis, but developing countries in the global south are facing so much inequality right now, and there is a lack of global solidarity to address these things. We have a rights gap. So many climate activists around the world have died because they have been protecting the land, and a majority of them are indigenous people. We have an adaptation and loss and damage gap. Larry talked about the fires, the heat dome that Canada lived in this last summer. We are not in the regular climate related event that we go through this year. where we have actually entered the era of losses and damages induced by the climate crisis. And the last gap is we have a trust and leadership gap. That means, and if you remember the elections, that even if climate is a concern for many of us, political leadership is lacking, and people more and more are not trusting leaders for the ability to find solutions. And so that's why I call this COP the COP of resistance. So let me just talk a little bit about some of the pillars that we are identifying that need to be addressed. And I'll go through this quickly. I talked to you about the power imbalance of this COP. The way in which COP26 could be successful is if COP26 actually allows for the participation and access to COP26 events and moments to everyone around the world. Some of you who will be at COP26, we will experience a very restrictive COP. And when we're there, the only thing that matters will be standing in solidarity to those who won't be able to access these spaces and should. So the UK has an obligation, but Canada also has an obligation to call for these events to be transparent, safe, healthy for everyone. The second one is addressing the ambition gap. Canada submitted a climate pledge. We have a plan where Canada commits to reducing emissions to 40% to 45% in 2030 below 2005 levels. But that plan, while better than the one we had before, does not put us in a pathway that leads us towards limiting global warming to 1.5. From a per capita basis, Canada remains the highest historical contributor to the climate crisis. So each of us, when you take our share of emissions and you divide it by the population of Canada, our share of emissions per capita is higher than the US and many other countries. And that is because we have such a small population for the amount of emissions that we emit. And so in this COP26, we will be calling for Canada to commit to aligning our climate pledges with a 1.5 compatible pathway as soon as possible, and at the latest by 2023. So we want Canada to enhance our climate pledge by 2023. And we also want Canada to put forward an implementation process that is fair, that includes workers, that includes women, that includes Indigenous peoples, that makes sure that we talk about health, about adaptation, and all these other priorities that are important when we have climate pledges. The third one is finance. You know how important finance is. Finance is important everywhere. In Canada, the Canadian government has invested billions of dollars for transportation, for adaptation, for different infrastructure plans, for zero emission vehicle mandates. But the fact is that even if Canada reduced to 100% our emissions by 2030, we won't be doing our fair share globally to help reduce emissions to a point that is 1.5 degrees compatible. So that's why we need to help other countries reduce their emissions and build resilience. That's, sorry, I'm gonna get my puppy who is asking for my attention. And in that sense, at COP26, Canada will have a very particular role to lead a process to identify how rich countries are going to pay developing countries to increase their mitigation and adaptation pledges. And Canada has committed to do this work with Germany. Canada has doubled our climate finance contributions, and now it is responsible for this global plan that needs to bring confidence, because so far, donor contributor-rich countries have not been able to pay what they must to the developing countries. They have failed up until now, and everyone around the world is calling for the $100 billion gap to be closed before COP26. The fourth one is the implementation gap.
Eddy, I'm going to have to ask you to be fairly quick now, if you wouldn't mind.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I'll go quickly. So the fourth one is the implementation gap, which is certainly on those things of the Paris Agreement that need to be agreed. This one is Article 6. The fifth one is adaptation and loss and damage, which is extremely related to, Larry, what you said earlier about these issues don't get serious attention at the negotiations. In particular, loss and damage, we are experiencing in Canada, and there is little attention to it. Canada needs to have a plan for future fires, devastating fires that destroy cities completely, like Lytton. The sixth one is making the implementation of the Paris Agreement about people. And this is, I think, something that remains a huge problem when it comes to just transition. We have just transition plans, we have ideas, but they don't include properly unions and workers in this process, and that needs to change. The seventh one is going to be on fossil fuels, and this is directly linked to Canada. In fact, Larry, and after this, I'm going to conclude. If we continue with the projected expansion of fossil fuels in Canada, by 2050, we might take 16% of the carbon budget globally. Maybe my concluding remark is as follows. The COP is complex, it is a complex space, but in one thing, if you're looking for one thing that you want to use to assess the COP26 success, is that governments can't fake climate leadership. It's not a COP that climate action happens. Climate action happens domestically, and you go to COP to be held accountable. So our role at COP26 is not to think about what COP can deliver, but how we make COP a place for urgent accountability to collectively implement pledges and put us on a 1.5 compatible power. So the call that I make, and that some of us are making around the world, is to use this COP to tell truth to power, where we force governments to be honest and transparent about the need to take action now. And that is why I think that COP will be important. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I have to tell you, it was physically painful to have to ask you to speed up because I was enjoying the presentation so much. It was very thorough and very clear, and gave me, for one, a much better understanding of the issues at play. So thank you so much for that. Tara, if you would you talk to us for a bit about the trade union perspective on COP26, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Larry, and thank you to the National Union for hosting this webinar and for inviting me and Eddy to come and speak today. I'll also acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the unceded traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin peoples, commonly known as Ottawa. Eddy, I think, outlined this COP and the context of the Paris Agreement and what we are looking to get out of that. And I guess I want to talk a little bit about why it matters to workers and why it matters to members of this union and what we do there and what our priorities are going to be at this COP. Of course, we work very closely with the broader civil society and are very integrated with the Climate Action Network delegation that goes to COP, and that will be no different this year. So, and Larry, you gave such a robust and thorough description of the Paris Agreement and sort of, some of these themes in terms of why it matters to workers and to your members. But, just to go back to the Paris Agreement, leading up to the Paris Agreement, trade unions worked extremely hard globally and with our allies to have a recognition of just transition as a key requirement of the Paris Agreement. We were successful in having that be implemented into the preamble of the agreement, where it says, taking into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. So, what unions bring to the table here really is a focus on the world of work and how work and climate intersect, and how this agreement and meeting our climate targets will impact on jobs, on a range of things. But when we talk about some of the unique proposition that we bring to COP, it is really around the world of work. Leading up to the Paris Agreement, the International Labour Organization, which is the only tripartite UN body where unions have an equal stake and equal sort of voice at this body, along with industry, employers, and government. So the ILO developed a series of guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. And this was really geared towards, thinking ahead to the Paris Agreement when they developed these guidelines. These guidelines are built on the 4 pillars of decent work: social dialogue, that means workers are at the table with power to sort of make decisions; social protection, that is our social safety net that Larry spoke about in his introduction; rights at work, so the right to join a union, the right to collectively bargain, the right to have a safe work environment, those kinds of rights at work. And employment, it's, that the creation of high quality jobs, reducing, trying to limit job loss and increase job creation be at the heart of this. And along with that, gender is a cross-cutting theme across all of those pillars. So that, that is at the heart of these ILO guidelines. I don't want to repeat too much of what Larry said, because of course he said it very, very well, but why does all of this matter for workers? I'm sure many of you have heard this line, that there are no jobs on a dead planet. It's a little bit quippy, but it is true. It is urgent. This is urgent. The latest report from the International Panel on Climate Change found that the last decade has been the hottest on record in the last 125,000 years. There is still time, but time is quickly running out to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, which will still mean that we are dealing with many impacts of climate change, but it means we will still have a livable planet that we can work from. So this is extremely urgent. So climate change is already affecting the lives and livelihoods and health of workers around the world, including Canada. Extreme heat, droughts, floods, wildfires. As Larry said, many of your members are on the front lines of these sort of, as you said, building climate with respect to the sort of the climate resilience of our infrastructure, fighting the fires, emergency responders, healthcare providers, all of those public sector workers that are delivering those services that everyone is going to need as the impacts of climate change continue to be with us in years to come. So a lot of what is going to happen at COP, we talk a lot about mitigation, climate mitigation, which is, how do we reduce the emissions enough to get to that limit of 1.5 degrees of warming? But we also have to accept that climate change is impacting us right now. And so, we are, as a trade union movement, are starting to look more and more at climate adaptation. Right. So climate adaptation is how do we, and this is really union work, right? How do we make sure that our infrastructure is resilient to the impact of climate change? How do we make sure that we have enough nurses and healthcare workers and emergency responders, paramedics and firefighters to deal with, what will be part of our reality for the coming future with respect to climate change? Trying to measure that and make the case that part of our, that climate adaptation is something that we have to deal with. I guess the other thing, another reason that this is important to workers is that we know it's been demonstrated that there is greater job potential in ambitious climate action than there is in doing nothing. Doing nothing is not an option for many, many reasons, but the impact on jobs of having ambitious climate action is demonstrated. In 2008, the ILO's flagship report focused on greening with jobs, that's the title of it, and it shows that there are 24 million new jobs that can be created globally by 2030 if the right policies to promote a greener economy are put in place now. So this matters, right? We can have, if we can think about 24 million new jobs around the world created by making the right decisions now, this matters to workers. Social justice and just transition will be the levers that will allow governments to go as far and as fast as we need to go to avert the worst impacts of climate change. So why do we participate at this COP? I absolutely agree with all of the challenges that Eddy spoke about in terms of the safety challenges, the equity challenges, the ambition challenges, and I won't repeat those because the Canadian labor movement is right there and agrees with that. But why do we go to these COPs in the first place, right? We work very closely as part of the global trade union movement, where we meet daily with our trade union colleagues from around the world, and we find places to push our governments, to hold our governments accountable. We also have very sort of tangible ways where we say, I've heard that this country is a bit of a holdup in this part of the negotiations, and we talk to our trade union colleagues from that country to say, can you talk to your government? And the same with us, through if there is news that Canada could be more helpful, or there's something that then we are sort of called to action to go and speak to our government. So that is some of the really tangible ways that we influence those negotiations at the COP. I'll talk a little bit about the trade union priorities for COP26. They are, not surprising, and they align in many ways with the priorities that Eddy spoke about for the broader sort of civil society movement. They're under the umbrella that social justice enables climate ambition. So that is the umbrella under which we are going to be working at this COP. And the first priority is that climate ambition with just transition policy measures. We'll be calling for climate ambition with just transition policies and measures in these enhanced NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, the plans for how do we, Eddy spoke about the increase in our ambition in our NDC from what it was to between 40 and 45%. We believe that in those NDCs, a focus on just transition, measuring the impact on jobs, and what are the measures being taken place to transition the workforce is an important component of meeting that ambition. The second priority that we will be pushing for at this COP is human and labor rights, making sure that parties commit to implementing inclusive climate policies that respect and promote human rights and labor rights. That will be a part of our work there that we will be pushing government parties to do. As Eddy spoke about, we will also be pushing for climate finance, increased climate finance, making sure that the rich countries of the world provide the necessary climate finance to decarbonize the global south, who have not seen the financial benefits of industrialization, right? And we are now pushing to decarbonize. The rich countries of the world need to do their fair share to make that happen. And then finally, pushing for industrial policy and investment. We want to see parties commit to implementing strong industrial policies and investment plans to underpin this transition to zero emission economies, right? That this is not going to happen without a plan, and to think that we will transition our economy away from high emitting sectors to a zero emission economy in a way that is fair and that builds the economy that we know benefits workers and society is not going to happen by accident. So we're going to push governments to do that work at this COP. Eddy spoke about a little bit about the forum on the impact and implementation of response measures and what's called the KCI, the Katowice Committee of Experts. Yes, that is certainly where just transition lives currently. There are many challenges with that case. The KCI has been politicized, as has this forum on response measures, in ways that are not always helpful to workers and unions and to tackling inequality. This is a challenging forum. Some of the parties that have outsized influence in this forum try to use this forum as a way to slow down ambition, to do those things that don't get us to where we need to be. There are a wide range of issues that are dealt with at this forum. It is not really just about just transition. It's all of the response measures, and many of those issues are controversial. So we see a lack of progress often in these forums. And we have found that there's a limited understanding of just transition and the role of social dialogue with workers at the table on par with governments and employers. And so while this is the part of the Paris Agreement and this COP where the part of this COP where these discussions take place, it is not without its problems. And so you will see that we continue to push governments to recognize just transition and the impact on work, both positive and negative, and measuring those transition supports. We would like to see that measured across parties in the nationally determined contributions. So that is a place where we think there's still lots of work to do. Aside from those negotiations, what will we do there? There are all kinds of side events. We will continue to work with civil society. There is a People Summit the second week where we will take part in those things. The ITUC will host a strategy day where trade unionists from around the world who are at this COP, and I think there may be an opportunity to participate virtually, but they are working on how to do a hybrid event like that. We'll strategize about what are our priorities, what will be our tactics, what are our campaigns on climate ambition and just transition. We will meet with the ministers who are there. We will push our priorities, I will say, both federally and provincially. There are usually ministers that attend the COP. We've had some success at previous COPs. The Just Transition Task Force on coal for Canadian coal power workers and communities that Larry mentioned, we were able to secure that because of activities that we took at COP. And while there is still lots of work to do to respond to that report, and it is not perfect, it is, I think, the reason the government is consulting on national just transition legislation right now. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I think there's lots more to talk about, but there's about 10 minutes left, I see, and I know that I see the questions popping up in the chat. I'm going to drop a few links of things as we go through the questions that may be useful to folks. So I'll leave it there for now, and back over to you, Larry.
Okay, two wonderful presentations. And I think the fact that people were not asking questions is an indication that they were just absorbed in your presentations. They didn't want to interrupt, and so congratulations to both of you for making the situation very clear. We have one question. We're a little bit short of time now, so we just have to be aware of that. But Anne has asked a question. Whichever one of you wants to take this, what's the most useful step a union member can take to support labor's agenda at COP26? Tara, why don't you start with that one?
Sure. So there are places that you can follow along. All of the plenary events will be streamed live. We are also, our trade union, the International Trade Union Confederation is pushing to make sure that some of the other forums where trade unions and other constituencies have some access to the presidency, finding ways to make sure that those are accessible virtually. So there's certainly ways to follow along there. We will be on days when we are taking action. We will be putting things where, there'll be ways for you to support the actions that we're taking there through social media, either on Twitter, on Facebook. I will send those links through probably Nadia, I assume, to make sure that as they, for folks who want to follow along in that way, they can have access. I'm going to put in the chat a forum on Facebook. It's the Trade Unions for Climate. That is where you will see climate activists in trade unions from around the world, where we get together in between COPs and during COPs. It gets very active during COP as people post a lot of things. So I'll put some, you can join that group if you're interested in sort of following the global climate trade union activities. I think those are some of the places. I think Twitter is a good way to move the debate, and to, it is a way to, this is where journalists are paying attention. It is where governments are paying attention. So there are some opportunities through social media for those at home. And I would, urge those who are interested to sort of try to stream some of those discussions in the background as you continue on with other work. Okay, thanks. Did you have anything to add on that question?
Yeah, I think Tara said it well. From a union's perspective, what I would just add is that NUPGE is a CAN member, and we follow the negotiations, the events, the participation of the government extremely closely. And we coordinate the information flow with union allies, indigenous peoples allies, different environmental organizations, and please, use the fact that you're a member of CAN to get as much information as possible. That's what we're here. It is our job to inform you about the process. We have different social media activities, media plans, and I think the best way to use this COP is to put pressure on governments at the local level. And so, yeah, use CAN to engage in this process. And a lot is happening virtually this year. So you might have access to follow some of the progress on the COP virtually.
Okay, thank you. And we'll do our best within our union as well to make sure that we get the information to people, make it available to people at least. We've got time for one more question, and we don't have one on the chat. So there's a question that I've been thinking about, Eddy, ever since you made the comment about the lack of trust. That lack of trust is pretty well deserved, because every government that I've ever heard speak about climate change is doing the best job anybody's ever heard of, and it's all wonderful. And the UK government on their website supporting COP26 says that they've done more to fight climate change than the world's ever heard of before, and blah, blah, blah. How do we get information that our members can trust, that we can trust, that says, peel back the surface of what these folks say they're doing and look at what they're really doing?
So that is definitely our job, to speak truth to power, to provide that kind of information. There are a lot of sources on the ground that will be tracking this kind of announcements from heads of governments. Maybe just to say that there's only one government that where you assess their policies is aligned with a 1.5 degrees compatible pathways, and is the Gambia, an African country who has not done much for this on this climate crisis, and that needs actually resources to transition. So you can imagine how far everyone else is and how much greenwashing could happen at this COP. And I am seeing it coming so much. So our job is going to be to assess what these leaders say and to help them accountable. There's also going to be regular assessment from Carbon Brief. They do regular analyses on what happens at COP. There's also the IISD produces daily briefs on COP that are extremely useful and test the ideas. There are also going to be a lot of fun events to allow for people to know about what's happening at COP. Fossil of the Day is one of them. It's a prize that CAN International gives to the worst performer at COP, and we give a fossil to the country that is blocking the negotiations. And we are making this public every single day. That is going to happen. And we're thinking even to actually trying to name one of these fossils the Queen of Fossils, because the Queen of England is actually coming to COP. So, and the UK, who is the presidency of the COP, continues to promote the expansion of fossil fuels. So we're going to speak truth to power at this summit.
Okay, thanks, Eddy. Tara, do you have anything to add to that?
No, just to agree with that, and that, we will also, through the CLC and through, I'm sure, affiliates will be posting things to social media along similar lines when there are challenges. And, absolutely, the lack of the trust gap is real globally, and in some cases here at home. And so taking action beyond those folks who are on the ground in Glasgow will be important.
Okay, thank you. One of the limitations of working on the screen like this is that if we were together and we had all the people in the room, you both would have gotten a standing ovation for your presentations. They were excellent and so informative, and really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. Edmund, thanks to your team as well. As always, it's been a pleasure working with you. From our point, from the National Union, As I said, we're going to be there at COP26. We're going to be there on the inside and on the outside with civil society. But I think it's important for us to say that we're not going to COP26 because that's the end of the journey. When we come back from COP26, in some ways, that will be when the real work starts. We'll be working with you folks, we'll be working with our allies to hold the government to account for what they said in Glasgow. And if they didn't say enough, then we'll be holding them to account for what they didn't say and should have. So our work will continue. Our committee will continue to work with them to get advice as to be as effective as possible in this really, the crisis that we're already in, a crisis that we can stop from being so devastating, but we're all going to have to work hard with you folks and with ourselves and our members to make sure it never gets that bad. And it can be done. As I said earlier on, we proved in COVID that governments representing civil society can get together and handle emergencies. So they need to do it again on a slightly different issue. Thanks everybody that joined us. I really appreciate it. And again, Eddy and Tara, thanks for spending some time with us. It's been a great event, and I think the lack of questions says that people were so interested in what you had to say that they didn't want to interrupt, as I said earlier. So very much appreciated. Take care, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.